Merci et bonjour. Je m'appelle Elizabeth May, chef de Parti Vert de Canada. I'm here this morning wishing I didn't have to take time in the press theatre to walk through a steady abuse of parliamentary democracy. It's been outrageous, but it's not making any noise. Preparing for this morning, I'm thinking, when democracy is attacked with guns, people notice. Ce n'est pas le cas ici au Canada, grâce à Dieu. Mais nous avons un problème sérieux parce que la démocratie, c'est une attaque vers notre démocratie. I think it's more like being smothered with a pillow. There's not a lot of noise being made, people don't notice, but democracy is at risk. I've served in this place and had the honor to represent Saanich Gulf Islands coming close to 15 years now. I became the first elected Green MP, so I was the only Green MP here, after the 2011 election that gave Stephen Harper a majority government. Listeners and viewers might think that must have been the worst thing possible, to be the only Green MP with a majority Harper government. But guess what? It's worse now. So what we have is a minority Liberal government, but with the collapse of the NDP, so that they're not a recognized party, and Greens aren't a recognized party, and obscure changes to obscure rules that happened during COVID and haven't been changed back, we have a situation where fewer bills are actually put to a vote. Canadians don't see this. I know some of the journalists who really pay attention to parliamentary procedures may notice that you can't find out how people voted at second reading because bills are passed on division. That doesn't mean they're unanimous. It just means that the Bloc Party, Bloc Québécois, and the Liberals and the Conservatives agree they don't want to waste the time for a recorded vote. But New Democrat MPs and Green MPs might indeed want a recorded vote so that our voters know where we stand on legislation. So bill after bill after bill has gone through second reading without a vote. And then what's truly, again, astonishing, because only a recognized party can now demand a recorded vote. The obscure rule I mentioned earlier very briefly was that before COVID, any 5 members of Parliament, whether they were independents or in unrecognized parties, which in 2011 was the Green Party and the Bloc Québécois, 5 MPs could stand at the moment the Speaker said, debate has collapsed. Does this House now agree the bill shall pass on division? If any member of a recognized party stands, we'll have a recorded vote. And at that moment, if 5 members of unrecognized parties stood, it forced a recorded vote. During COVID, that rule ended. That's why 7 New Democratic Party members of Parliament and I together can't force a recorded vote. As long as the Bloc Québécois and the Liberals and the Conservatives are on the same page, it bulldozes right through. Do Canadians know that in a minority parliament, bills are going through without votes at second reading because the Liberals and the Conservatives and the Bloc are working together, far from being a parliament that doesn't function well together, where one party is obstructing the other. Maintenant, c'est clair que nous avons un niveau de coopération non pareil. We're seeing the Conservatives back the Liberals every time, on almost every bill. C9 is the exception, which has been caught up in committee over religious questions, but I'll leave that to the side. I sketch out today, and it will be placed very shortly on websites and is available to all media, a series of moments when it became clear that democracy was at risk. They coincide with everything that's happened since Mark Carney became Prime Minister and Parliament was in session, but they're not uniquely the problem of the Liberal Party. Other parties could stand up and demand more. But the pattern was established back in June with Bill C5. The Bill C5 was inadequately studied, hardly studied at all. Omnibus bill with unprecedented power grabs from the central executive, the Prime Minister, and the Cabinet. So we had under Bill C5, which seems so long ago now, but June, put through Parliament so rapidly, a bill that said we can, in the interest of building a project of national significance, a term It's not defined in the bill, despite what the press releases from the Liberals said. No defined criteria must be met to declare a project is of national significance, at which point, if completing that project breaks other laws, that's okay. That's based on the precedent of the King Henry VIII clause. King Henry VIII said, if I'm passing a law that breaks other laws I've already passed, that's okay. When Liberals said to me at the time, this was just what we promised in the election, I said to some, because we're chummy, and why not? I said, well, I don't remember that the Liberal campaign theme song was I'm Henry VIII, I am. Don't remember that at all. So the Henry VIII clause lets bills being passed here break other laws. And then they'd say, oh, well, but not the criminal code. And on C5, oh, but also we won't break the code of ethics. And when the cry came out from First Nations across Canada, what about the law that says the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is law in Canada? The Liberals responded with what they must have thought was an adequate public relations sop to that concern, and they added, and we can't break the Indian Act. There's never been a more naked proclamation of profound ignorance of Indigenous law than saying, and we won't break the most racist piece of legislation in this country that doesn't protect Indigenous rights at all. So that was C5. It passed in a hurry. As I detail here in this briefing note, because of the support from the Conservative Party, not only did it pass, but the programming motion that was brought forward on Friday the 13th of June was supported line by Conservatives. This programming motion was breathtaking in its contempt for Parliament and in contempt for the fundamental principle that Parliament should study the laws we are passing. So on Monday, June 16th, second reading begins on C5. There's no committee in place to study the bill, mind you, till Tuesday the 17th, when at 3:30 in the afternoon, the committee is put in place. And it begins hearing from witnesses. It ends at 5:30 after electing its executive. Then in the evening, it hears from witnesses. Amendments to this omnibus bill are due Wednesday the 18th at noon. And the committee begins starting clause by clause that very evening. And by sometime in the wee hours of the morning of Thursday the 19th, the bill has gotten through committee, all amendments reviewed, not reviewed really, because they stopped debate at midnight, just said we pass them without debate going forward. By Friday, June 20th, we have forced through report stage, third reading, done and dusted by evening, and summer adjournment begins. Now, I'd like to say that was the last we've seen of that kind of thing, but the Budget Implementation Bill C-15, which last night was pushed through report stage, we have yet to pass it at third reading, has not been properly studied. It's over 600 pages long. Whole sections have received only the scantest of reviews. Attempts to amend Bill C-15 were largely unsuccessful, except for one thing. The Conservative Party, for the first time, looking at a major piece of government legislation, said we won't vote for this unless there's a change. And I do think that my raising the concern that we had in C-15, Part 5, an unprecedented, smaller version, but still very disturbing version of the King Henry VIII clause, that any cabinet minister acting alone, if it's an area within their general jurisdiction, can exempt any entity from any federal law, again, except the criminal code. And that they must make this public as soon as is feasible with no timeline. So trying to condense this as quickly as possible in C-15's review in the Finance Committee this week, and due to obviously negotiations between the Conservatives and the Liberals on a Conservative motion from the member for Newmarket Aurora, we had some improvements. Slight improvement, but significant in transparency. A minister who proposes to exempt a corporation from following Canadian law must give notice and have a 30-day consultation period. And if they decide to exempt that entity from having to obey Canadian law, they must make that public within 30 days. But it is quite breathtaking that it's now the case, because I think we all fully expect that, having bulldozed through everything, including the report stage yesterday, that third reading will be a matter of course now that the Conservatives have decided to stop objecting to C-15. What we'll have is C-15 going through, which will mean that the Red Tape Reduction Act is amended to allow a minister with more transparency than before, exempting any entity from the application of a Canadian law. Now, that's not, the briefing I prepared for this morning includes what happened with Bill C-2. Again, an unprecedented sleight of hand by the governing party, having brought forward the Strong Borders Act, prompting the creation of a coalition of more than 300 non-government organizations, everyone from Human Rights Watch to the United Church to Open Media to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, saying the Strong Borders Act is appalling. We can't have the post office opening our mail without warrant. We can't be cracking down on refugees in this way and violating international refugee law. So I had hoped, and in the press conference starting here in September of 2025, said the Green Party priority for this Parliament among climate action and shortlist is to stop Bill C-2. So since the governing party hadn't moved Bill C-2 to a vote at second reading, and they'd only had a couple of days of debate in the House, I thought maybe we're winning on this one. And then on October 8th, the government introduced Bill C-12, which was virtually the same as C-2, except it took out the parts about warrantless access to our mail and to intellectual property information and internet providers providing information about their customers without a warrant. Again, gets somewhat complicated, but C-2 and C-12 were so substantially similar. The Speaker ruled on my point of order on this point earlier this week, but I won't get into the weeds on that one. But C-12 was bulldozed through the House. The Senate looked at it, and the Senate committee was firm in its and quite critical of the House of Commons in its language in saying the bill hadn't been properly studied. The Senate committee, I thought, was going to put forward amendments to change C-12 to protect refugee rights, at least somewhat. They backed down and were satisfied in the Senate to at least rebuke the House for failing to properly study Bill C-12. And then we go forward. C-12 has now passed completely through the House of Commons, and C-2 remains to be put on the order paper for a vote at second reading, even though it is substantially the same as C-12 and violates the same question rule, which is, again, back into the weeds of parliamentary procedure. On February 13th, I brought forward a series of amendments to one of the bills that I think more violates 500 years of British jurisprudence of criminal law than anything I've seen. When you talk about tough on crime, it's an interesting thing to have two conservative parties battling it out in the House of Commons, with the Liberals' version of conservatism saying we're tough on crime, and the Conservatives saying, no, you're not tough on crime, you're coddling the criminals. But C-14 is a bill that says, essentially, that the principle of innocent until proven guilty is turned on its head. And when someone who is an accused person who's been convicted of nothing seeks bail, the onus is on them to prove to the Crown why they should receive bail. Again, this doesn't require, we have a lot of rhetoric, a lot of legitimate concern from Canadians when people hear a crime has been committed by someone out on bail. The focus of their attention is that somehow the system is coddling criminals, instead of what we should be thinking is, why are we so underfunding the criminal justice process at the provincial level that people can't get speedy trials? People being out on bail is normal. Someone who's an innocent until proven guilty, hasn't gone to court, hasn't had any charges proved against them. The general process across Canada has been for a long time, let that person, unless they're a threat to society, let them continue to hold down a job. Let them take care of their families. They are convicted of nothing. They stand accused. In any case, amendments on Bill C-14 were brought forward at report stage. I brought them forward in the normal way. They were accepted as within scope by the Speaker and the legal apparatus of the House of Commons. They were seconded by the Honourable Member for Nunavut, Laurie Idlut. And then I fully expected, since they were moved and seconded at report stage, that we would, at the next time it came up on the order paper, be debating and voting on them in the House. and this is unprecedented, from the floor without any objection from any party, out of the blue, Assistant Deputy Speaker John Nader ruled, which was bizarre, and it's in the statement, you can look it up so I won't read the whole thing, that basically, this has never happened in Parliament before, he said. We've had these motions moved and seconded, and I spoke to them briefly to call for them to be passed, and then I was on an airplane to Tumbler Ridge. I had informed the table officers. People knew that I wasn't going to be able to participate even virtually. I got the motions, the amendments were moved and seconded. And then the speaker said, well, this has never happened in Canada before, but we found a precedent in the British House of Commons, and we can now declare that all of these amendments, and this isn't, I don't even sure it's a word, they've been negativized. All the amendments stopped right there so that Bill C-14 passed through every remaining stage that day, February 13th. Now we have, I just want to briefly update Bill C-4, still before the Senate. Again, another omnibus bill. C-4 on superficial first reading looked like everything the Conservatives, rather, slip of the tongue, the Carney Liberals had said they were going to deliver during the election. Getting rid of the consumer carbon price, taking GST off homes, affordability. But stuck in there was this bizarre Part 4 of Bill C-4, which when I noticed it, I took it around Parliament in June and showed it to my Liberal MP friends and said, hey, what's this? Part 4 of Bill C-4, amendments to the Elections Act. Obviously nothing to do with affordability, unless it was the affordability to the Liberal Party of lawyers, but we'll leave that to the side. It said all provisions of the Elections Act that protect the private information of Canadians, and there are not many of them, by the way, all these sections are, quote unquote, deemed never to have come into force and are repealed. Bit of overkill there. But on top of that, it said Bill C-4, Part 4, when it comes into effect, shall come into effect in the year 2000. And I took this around to some of my Liberal colleagues and said, what's that? They said, well, that must be a typo. I don't know. That's deliberate. That's not a typo. That's a time machine. Year 2000. That means for the last 26 years, any offense that has occurred for the holding of private and personal information of Canadians by a political party, if it gives rise to any kind of an offense, it can't, because personal and private information of Canadians was never covered, because this bill, which is still before the Senate, took effect 26 years ago, but it hasn't passed yet. Now, yesterday in the Senate, there was a real show of effort. As I said, on C-12, the senators were concerned. On C-4, they haven't quite given up yet. Yesterday, there were speeches from a number of senators, and they concluded with Bill C-4 not be read the third time, but amended by deleting Part 4. They suspended debate at 4 p.m. and will resume it today at 1:30. I hope that the Senate exercises the sober second thought we so desperately need now. We have a prime minister who's at the beginning of what one might think of as a learning curve. No question, a brilliant man. Prime Minister Mark Carney served as governor of the Bank of England, governor of the Bank of Canada, an impressive resume, no doubt. Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, financiers, banking knowledge, second to none. But he's never been a member of Parliament before. And the learning curve starts by understanding that you have something to learn. So if you're at the bottom of your learning curve and you think you already know everything, and nothing is a bump in the road, bulldozing just keeps happening. Bulldozing through Bill C-5, bulldozing through C-8, bulldozing through C-14, bulldozing through C-15. The list is long. We need a bump in the road. We need a learning curve experience. The Prime Minister, as we know, is widely supported across Canada. I also hope for the success of Mark Carney, because in the face of Donald Trump, that also represents the success of Canada. but not at the cost of parliamentary democracy, not at the cost of finding that legislation passed in 2025 and 2026 will, through its flaws and poor drafting, come back to bite us. Where in our society it does, we don't know. We know that Mike Harris's common sense revolution in getting rid of red tape killed people in Walkerton, because getting rid of red tape sometimes gets rid of health and safety regulations. I know the Canadian Cancer Society opposed Part 1 of Bill C-5 because they thought it would increase the risk of carcinogens reaching Canadians. But those witnesses from the Canadian Cancer Society never got to testify before the amendments to Bill C-5 were due at noon Wednesday, June 18th. C'est clair que maintenant nous avons la preuve que les libéraux prennent les libertés avec les règles habituelles. Nous n'avons pas maintenant une vraie démocratie, mais seulement peut-être une mise en scène. I really hope Canadians pay attention. It's very hard if it's not in the daily press. It's very hard to think that it really matters that bills be studied. But as a parliamentarian who values the term parliamentarian in my life above all else, certainly I don't like being called a politician. I love being called a parliamentarian. I love our rules. I love Westminster parliamentary democracy. And I can't stand by silent while I see it trampled. Merci.
Hi, David Burton, CBC. Good morning.
Good morning, David.
I'm surprised you didn't mention maybe something else some folks would say is a way that Carney's trampling on parliamentary democracy. Some folks might point out his bid to lower floor crossings to obtain a majority. Would you add that to your list?
No, because you know what? Floor crossing is part of Westminster parliamentary democracy. Whether it's admirable, whether that's a good way to form a majority government when the voters have denied you a majority government a few months ago. But I mean, as a great parliamentarian in the Westminster parliamentary tradition, Winston Churchill, I mean, it was a long time ago, 1915, famously crossed the floor and then after some time crossed back. And I think the quote was, he said, to rat is controversial, but to re-rat takes real ingenuity. So I don't expect Matt Genereux to re-rat. I don't think Pierre Poilievre would welcome him back anytime soon. But I also think that voters, in principle, in practice, political parties have achieved so much power that candidates are almost irrelevant. They might as well be plywood caricatures of their leader with a tape-recorded message that you play. They're proxy stand-ins for their party leader in practice, but are underpinning the ideological and philosophical and fundamental framework of Westminster parliamentary democracy is that voters are voting for their own member of parliament who will represent them well in parliament. And the voters who chose Chris d'Entremont and I know Chris, he's a fine guy, and he had been in the cabinet in Nova Scotia as a progressive conservative. He's joined the new version of the Progressive Conservative Party, which is headed by Mark Carney and is the Liberal Party. It's up to his voters if they think their Progressive Conservative member of Parliament has strayed far from what they elected him to do by becoming a Progressive Conservative wearing the Liberal shirt, still a Progressive Conservative. And when you have two Conservative parties at the federal level duking it out, a right-wing populist Conservative Party led by Pierre Poilievre and a Progressive Conservative Party led by Mark Carney, it's not such a stretch to see people doing floor crossing. I do think it makes voters feel slightly sick of the political games, but it's not trampling democracy, strangely enough. It's just within our rules and within parliamentary practice, it's not unethical, but it does make people feel that that there's a ruthlessness afoot.
You spent a lot of time with the Prime Minister over the last couple of weeks, traveling to Tumblewood Ridge. That was a long flight over. What was that flight like?
Well, I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for inviting all of us. I don't think there's and I've experienced it from so many people, whether random strangers when I'm catching a train or walking the main street of the town where I live, people stopping me to say it meant so much to them to see all the Canadian Federal Party leaders united in our shared grief and in supporting a community in mourning. The fact that a First Nations elder at the vigil said, "Now hold hands," and we all did. I think that kind of image gives Canadians a sense of, and it did me too, it's very moving, a sense of pride. And so I'm grateful the Prime Minister invited us all, and so did Premier David Eby invite every party in the BC legislature. So my friend Jeremy Valeriot, who's a Green MLA, was there with the leader of the Conservative Party of BC. And again, we all held hands, both the Lieutenant Governor and Governor General and so on. It was Canada, I think it was, I mean, you can't say it's Canada at our best when we've just had a horrific school shooting that could have been avoided. But it's Canada at our best when we put aside partisanship. Now, as for the flight, it was a small plane, and it was a very good and fuel-efficient way to get all of us to Tumbler Ridge. Don Davies and I were, it was, kind of knees to knees. You're two seats facing Yves-François Blanchet, Pierre Poilievre, two seats facing the Prime Minister, and Diana Fox-Carney were slightly removed, but we chatted through the flight. We obviously didn't talk about anything controversial. I had just put forward my amendments on Bill C-14, and we didn't discuss them. It wasn't the kind of trip where we were debating and discussing how we were going to handle legislation, nor was it appropriate for me in that context of mourning, but to say this is being bulldozed. I still feel the PTSD from what happened Monday, June 16th, Tuesday, June 17th, Wednesday, June 18th, when at midnight the debate ended and the amendments passed without debates, one after the other, till 2 or 3 in the morning. I forget at what time. And then resuming again the next day, Friday, June 20th, to push the bill all the way through. My last speech on Bill C-5, which I doubt if anyone watched, was just before the final forced through passage of the bill, when I said, well, the Prime Minister is still in the honeymoon period, but most people expect that in a honeymoon period, acts are consensual. I have never felt so thoroughly bulldozed in my life as the way in which that bill went from start to finish in 4 days. And we have still, what was the hurry? As some media have pointed out, not a single project has been designated a project of national significance. What was the rush? Why couldn't we study that bill? Why couldn't we find out why the Canadian Cancer Society felt that Part 1 of the bill would expose Canadians to the risk of carcinogens? We were in too big of a rush to find out.
You mentioned you had PTSD. Just to clarify, was that from, do you mean that?
No.
You mean that?
I mean, when I think, okay, the fact that I can remember standing here in February, what it felt like Monday, June 16th, when we go to second reading and it passes second reading, debate starts, and then it's gone because of the programming motion. At every stage, things are abrupt. At every stage, things are limited. So it was bulldozed, and I physically feel the effects of a bulldozer running over me. I know it's metaphorical. I know a bulldozer didn't really run over me. But in the time I've been in Parliament, I've never seen Parliament itself treated with such contempt. And I find that upsetting at a visceral level.
We're going to hear from political leaders today, including the Conservative leader, about Canada-U.S. relations. Dominic McLaughlin, what I understand, is also giving a speech. It'd be great to hear from you about your thoughts on where we are at as the Green Party leader, and what changes you think the government needs to make.
I think we need to protect the economic sovereignty of Canada, and we're not doing that. The Build, Baby, Build strategy, the entire budget was designed, as is said within the budget, to come up with a lower corporate tax rate than that of Trump's big, beautiful bill. The last time we saw massive influx of foreign direct investment from corporations outside Canada was when Harper got rid of the income trust deduction, and then we saw foreign direct investment with foreign companies buying up Canadian companies. So just the fact that we're attracting investment doesn't mean we're protecting Canada. And if foreign corporations are buying up Canadian companies, I don't think that gives us economic sovereignty. It just means we might be responsible to a different colonial master. We should not be a colony of other countries, and to protect ourselves from that, we need to invest in Canadian companies. We need to stop having the Canadian pension plan invested in corporations in the U.S. and in other countries. We need to change the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board Act to say specifically that it must invest in ways that are for the well-being of Canada and Canadians. We can even, if we choose to, say that they can only take our pension plan dollars and invest them in Canada. Right now, we're invested in U.S. companies, in fossil fuels, because that's what the Act says. We could also create strategic reserves for our natural resources. We could buy up all of the Canadian aluminum that right now has been hit with heavy tariffs in the U.S. We could pay market price as a country to take the $15 billion worth of aluminum that gets sold to the U.S., keep it in Canada, use it for our own companies, use it for our own industries. We could buy up all the potash and put it in reserves where Canadians can buy bonds and get a guaranteed 5% return on investment for every bond they buy. That is a saving Canada bond, not a Canada savings bond. We had, as a party, we had most of these ideas reviewed and analyzed by the Parliamentary Budget Office for the election. They are still on the PBO website. They are viable, they are doable, and they do more to protect our economic sovereignty than going to the United Arab Emirates and celebrating that we're going to get $70 billion from that country, instead of keep investing in Canadian companies, keep ensuring that our resources are used. For instance, softwood lumber, we shouldn't be exporting any unprocessed lumber from this country. We should be processing it here to build homes here. I could go on, but economic sovereignty is key. That doesn't mean caving to Trump. That doesn't mean when Trump says what we just voted on last night and tried to stop getting rid of the digital services tax, which is part of C-15. Trump said, I don't like your digital services tax. At the time he said that, this was an act of Parliament passed before Prime Minister Carney became Prime Minister. We put in place a digital services tax. We've never collected it. It affects our bottom line that we're not collecting it. We're in the process of repealing it in C-15. And the Honourable Lloyd Axworthy, who is, after all, a well-known Liberal and former cabinet member in this country, much respected, called Mark Carney's reaction to Trump saying we should drop the digital services tax, and Mark Carney said immediately, yes, we will. Lloyd Axworthy said that was bootlicking. I think we need to keep elbows up, but we also need to protect our economy in real ways. We don't need to call Trump names. We're going to have to deal with the United States and make sure that the United States and the people of the United States know that we are neighbors and friends and there for them. If they had a disaster and they need help, we'll send help. But we do not have to put up with being ridiculed and attacked, and we will certainly stand shoulder to shoulder with Greenland or any other country that Trump chooses to threaten. But we are not yet protecting our own economy. I do not see in Budget 2025, nor in the Prime Minister's speech in Davos, which was brilliant, and I was cheering. Everybody enjoys seeing your Prime Minister do well on the world stage. I would have cheered if he had said, instead of middle powers, democracies that share our values and protect human rights. Those are the places we need to expand and diversify our trading relationship. Democracies around the world that share our values and defend human rights and fight for the climate. That's where we should be diversifying trade.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci. Ça conclut cette conférence de presse.
Merci beaucoup.